Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Winnie Varghese, and I'm a priest at Trinity Church on Wall Street. I'm also happy to be a member of Habitat's New York City's Building on Faith community, which is an amazing interfaith initiative here in New York. I'm happy to introduce Habitat New York City's Vice President of External Affairs and today's guest speakers. So please join me first in welcoming Matt Dunbar. Matt?
Great. Thank you so much, Reverend Winnie, and thank you to everybody that's tuning in to this panel and to the Habitat New York City Virtual Habitat House Party.
Thank you. And then next, we welcome Pastor Monrose, who is the Reverend Gilford T. Monrose, amongst many other things. And he really does have a remarkable number of things that he engages as a leader. He is the pastor of Mount Zion Church of God, president of the 67th Precinct Clergy Council, director of the Faith-Based and Clergy Initiative at the Brooklyn Borough President's Office, and serves as a member of Habitat New York City's Leadership Council. Welcome, Pastor Monrose.
Thank you so much, and it's good to be here.
And then we have Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanofsky of Congregation Anshe Chesed, a synagogue on Manhattan's Upper West Side and longtime faith partner of Habitat New York City. Rabbi Kalmanofsky regularly publishes on Jewish thought and practice, and he serves on the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you guys.
So welcome, everyone. Matt, before we get started, or maybe we can start with you telling us a little bit more about yourself and what Building on Faith is.
Sure, great. Thank you so much, Reverend Winnie. Again, my name is Matt, and I am the Vice President of External Affairs at Habitat for Humanity New York City. I have a kind of a long background in working with faith community on a host of various issues, and I actually started with Habitat New York City a little over a decade ago as the Faith and Community Relations Associate. So it's great to reconnect with everybody here on the panel and engaging the faith community in the work of Habitat for Humanity is a real passion of mine. As my background, I have a degrees in religion and politics, the two things that you're apparently not supposed to talk about in polite conversation, but we don't abide by those rules here at Building on Faith. We think that there are two extremely important things to talk about. And so what our Building on Faith initiative really is meant to do is to try to engage folks of all faiths and no faith in the conversation around how our world views and our perspectives and our faith traditions really help to enforce and motivate us into taking action around affordable housing. And so this is one of many conversations that we're going to be having along the faith, race, and housing landscape. And we're really excited to see and engage more faith communities and people of faith in the work that we do across the 5 boroughs of New York City.
Thanks, Matt. I've had the opportunity to be part of the conversations here at Habitat, and I've learned so much and been really inspired by the faith community's leadership. And in those conversations, we've discussed homeownership as an essential tool for families of color to build wealth and financial stability. However, homeownership is often out of reach for families of color historically due to racist housing policies of the past and some of the present and the persistence of the racial wealth gap. So I'd like to start off with Reverend Monrose and Rabbi Jeremy. Have the community members in your congregations experienced barriers to home ownership?
Definitely. I think that home ownership is the pathway to economic success in America. And I think that Dr. King, the last 3 years of his life, he continued to push for the fact that we needed land ownership. Land ownership stretched back from generations. It helped generations to achieve in school, sending the children to the best colleges that we have found. And it also gave you heritage as well in terms of having to step up. So in our communities, especially in central Brooklyn, what you find is that home ownership is a problem in terms of making sure that those who are living in the lower income communities, it has the ability to own them. NYCHA, for the most part, I think if we look at it, there should be a play to increase our affordable housing opportunities for for people who live in those communities, because we know for sure that, and I think for sure that if you have home ownership on another level, the life of our young Black men and women will increase tremendously if they can walk into a home by the time that they're an adult.
Yeah, so I'm the rabbi of a conservative synagogue on the Upper West Side. In Judaism in general, the conservatives are liberals, so don't be fooled by the names. Naturally, we do have a range of economic, backgrounds in our community, and we have people who are really struggling. But in the main, I would not say, and we certainly do have Jews of color in our community, but I would certainly say that the racist, the structural racism that has created wealth gaps and housing gaps is not something that my community feels directly all that much, right? We are an overwhelmingly white community, and I think that the community is very, very engaged in questions of remaking the racial justice landscape in this country, but it's not because we are in the main the victims of that system.
Actually, add to that from my perspective at Trinity, we are a multiracial congregation, and varied across income and opportunity, immigrant families, longtime New York families, and you can see this divide in our community. While we have some folks who are homeless or unhoused, and we have some folks in transitions of different kinds, you can see the families who have struggled for generations to get a foothold in the city, and those for whom, within our own congregation, a little bit of access to capital at the right time, no restriction on where they could buy, means that they actually have extraordinary wealth in their homes here in this city. So we see the entire spectrum, and it feels very convicting.
Yeah. Yeah, I would add to that. The statistics definitely show that out. Just to throw in a few numbers. Across the country, the home ownership rate is generally about 64%, and in New York City, the home ownership rate is only at 31%. But the Black-white home ownership gap is very strong here in New York City, in the sense that it's about 43% of white households own their own home in New York City, whereas I think it's around 27% of Black households own their own home. And I believe it drops down even potentially to around 20% or below for Latinx households. So we definitely see, the history of some of the policies of redlining and policies, from the federal government that promoted white ownership in the past, that continues to have that legacy existing today. And Reverend Winnie, you said it great in your introduction. There's both racist policies of the past and of the present, and so we see that in the neighborhoods that we serve, and where we're even able to build homes due to property values and access to buildable land.
My guess would be that a question some people watching us might have, as much everyone that would come to watch this would be interested in housing and affordable housing, accessible housing, but people might wonder why we as communities of faith do this work. What is it in our faith communities that drives us towards this kind of work?
Am I going first? Well, for me, the Jesus that I served, who had no home, it also brings to bear that when you are dealing with poor, and I know that we don't use the word poor a lot. If you look at the presidential debates and all the platforms, the word poor is not really mentioned. But Jesus made a lot of statements about the poor. And I think that when you're living in poverty and you're living in hell, it's very hard to even concentrate on a lot of things that you need to make you spiritually whole. Now, I might add that historically speaking, people who have gone through slavery, segregation, have always clung to God in a special way, because at the end of the day, we knew that there was no hope coming from our government. And they looked towards God. I mean, the Psalms talks about looking to the hills from whence cometh your help. So I think that as people of faith, we have to always remember that our mandate and our calling is to the poor among us. And I think that if we follow and we keep in track of what we are called to be, Paul will always be on our mind. So it's definitely a situation where, out of my faith, we have to talk about the poor that's among us and challenge the system so that we can make sure that we have equity across the board.
I'd like to add to that. The Hebrew Bible asserts this most central idea in our faith, that all human beings are B'Tselem Elohim, created in the image of God. And certainly the Hebrew Bible is mostly focused on the people of Israel, but very interestingly, the times that it mentions this doctrine that all people are created in the divine image are only in the first chapters of Genesis, before there is a people of Israel. It's speaking to the human race in general. And so it's very profound to me as a Jew who is concerned with, who is deeply embedded in the experience of one of the world's families, to be reminded constantly that the ethical duties that we have and the spiritual relationships that we have to our fellow human beings are not exhausted by caring for your own family, but caring for all human beings who bear the image of God. The book of Leviticus tells you two kinds of love. You are commanded to love your neighbor as yourself, and we Jews take that to be your neighbors who are like yourself, who share a past and share a future, and to love the stranger, for God loves the stranger. You are commanded to love the people who are just like you, who share your community and experience, and you are commanded to love the people who are nothing like you, who have very different sets of experiences, and you are not permitted to just say, my own family, my own home is the only important thing. So you have to cultivate and build the care for all kinds of people.
And Matt, this is sort of a presumptuous question on my part, but I assume that you come to this work as a person who works at Habitat from a place of faith. So how does that work for you?
Yeah, no, I mean, my path to Habitat, is kind of long. I grew up in the Central Valley of California, my personal faith, I consider myself, interdenominational. As I was baptized Episcopalian as a baby, and then and then later on, I went to both the local Episcopal church, but then I also got really involved and engaged in my local evangelical church, and I was a drum set player and a leader in my youth group as a young man, and actually was thinking about going into the ministry for a time, but my calling kind of veered away from that path, which obviously was motivated by my faith, but my calling kind of moved towards actually trying to support the external ministries of faith communities. So how could I potentially help be a conduit for people to live out the missions of their communities and congregations and the calling of their faith to actually help to serve and to change kind of the systems and structures that surrounded both their communities and their neighbors. And it's important for me, what's interesting about Habitat is that we bring both conservative and more liberal perspectives together, both theologically and politically in many times. And I was raised much more conservative within my theology and my politics probably than I currently am now. But the mission of Habitat kind of marries the idea of directly serving neighbor. And oftentimes from my experience, the more conservative theology had a bit more of a focused aspect of neighbor as being the people that you really interact with and having a personal responsibility for the individuals that we really connect with on a daily basis, or the person that you see, potentially experiencing homelessness in the street or things of that nature. And it's really more tied to service. And as my perspective changed, also there was, and I learned more, really a lot of it was about education, about the systems and structures that I didn't experience personally as a white heterosexual man from an upper middle class family. I didn't experience a lot of the systemic barriers that existed, but over the course of my career, and especially at Habitat, I've learned so much more about the history of redlining and the policies that undergird the inequalities that persist today. And so what I love about Habitat is that it allows all of us to come together to both serve directly as well as to learn about, educate, and then ultimately try to address some of the larger systemic issues that lead to the cause for people to be housing insecure and unstable. So my work with Habitat is very deeply personal to my faith, and I love kind of engaging people wherever they are in their faith to try to live out the calling and the mission together.
Yeah. So from my perspective, and yes to all the squares. I love what you all have said. I'm at Trinity Church, and before a couple of jobs ago, I was a chaplain at Columbia, and I found myself in the elevator one day with Manning Marable, the historian, and really was in awe. I'm a fan, right? And I had heard once that he, like Matt, was baptized an Episcopalian. So I asked him that because I was the Episcopal chaplain, because it would be cool to have Manning Marable in our chaplaincy. That would have blown it up, right? So I asked him, sir, if he was, and if he was an Episcopalian, and he looked up and thought for a minute, and then looked at me and said, the Episcopal Church frames my imagination. So it's T.S. Eliot. It's a very Anglican way to approach it, right? He's quoting Eliot, which says that faith frames our imagination. And so that is, I think, what we do when we kind of come from a position of faith, right? That for people that need to be raised up, that deserve to be raised up, it's saying that we can imagine more for you, more than the world will tell you that you deserve. And for all of us that live in, I think, the painful place and the really problematic place of having what we need and being told to only look after our communities, we can imagine a world in which no one is unhoused, that people have what they need, that housing is not a commodity for wealth as much as it is a service, right? Something that we all need. And I think that's one of the gifts that faith communities bring, that we can imagine something very different together as we imagine towards an ultimate justice. So I want to talk about that imagining space a little bit. In your communities, how does this, we're going to ask you concretely about how you do this work, like how you've gotten your communities involved, because we want to get other communities as engaged as yours. But in that space of imagining that this is our work together, that we should do this, how has that been true in your community, and how has that played out if it has? I'm looking at the square always first. That's Pastor Monrose, but anyone can start.
I guess I can go for sure. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about what you say, Winnie, and it's the idea too is that we are reimagining the idea of affordable housing, and I just can't imagine why in our country that is quote unquote based on Christian values that our laws are not reflective to the work that we are talking about. And it seems like in the politics and in the halls of Congress that this whole faith that we're talking about stops at the door. So I think that moving forward, one thing that we have to do as faith leaders is press those who are in power to understand the plight of the small man or the poor, as I said, among us. How are we reimagining this in our communities? I think more and more people are understanding, even developers, especially with houses of worship, where my experience is in terms of leading the borough as the faith-based director and working on a plan that deals directly with when you have a church that is a land rich but cash poor, that they have an ability to be able to use in the flight of the crack epidemic. There was a lot of churches in Brownsville and in Bed-Stuyvesant who stayed when everyone left. And I think that the houses of worship should be part of the revival that we're seeing in New York City right now. And so what we have been sharing with them and what I have been reimagining with them, along with the borough president, is taking the property in which those who have gone before had spent years of their labor, getting paid at the smallest level, putting into the churches, to not lose it because of modern gentrification that comes into our community. So what we have been doing, my reimagining is helping faith leaders keep the property, by using it to do affordable or sometimes market rate homes, but at the same time showing them, giving them the tools to be in the same field with developers and not giving away the property that so much of centuries and decades ago that their forefathers and the mothers and the sisters and the brothers who came to the church at that point in time helped to build.
Reverend Winnie, I am reminded from your comments, which were tremendously beautiful. There was a thinker in the middle of the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel. He's perhaps well known in the wider world, and he said that to pray is to dream in league with God. Like, to pray is to dream in league with God for what the world might be. And so your comment is really very stirring, to think about dreaming for an alternate reality. I would say, that my community does not find it a terribly hard leap or a hard ask to engage in acts of service. I would say that our growth area is in acts of the imagination about what might be quite different. I think we've got I wouldn't exaggerate and say that we're exemplars of an ethic of service, but we can do our little part, and we have had in our synagogue building for many years until the pandemic began, a nightly shelter. And we've fed a good number of people and housed a good number of people on that very temporary night-to-night basis. But I think that the next challenge for a community, and the coincidence of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter, just flourishing with the protests, and the not just acts of protest, but shifts in mindset of the last several months, will be a very interesting set of challenges and set of possibilities. And I don't really know yet how that turn and that journey will be for a community. I think that my community, I experience our community as having their hearts in a very good place, and like kind of dimly glimpsing work that is possible, and kind of, like feeling their way in the darkness. And so it's partly my job and partly other people's job to help nurture that sense of possibility. And I was speaking with Matt before the call about what, and don't know what the levers yet are to make a shift from the immediacy and tenderness of an act of service, even if it's not in the way that we were talking about the way you were talking just now, and the way we spoke before on the call, about only caring for our own within the community. It's not that. It is an act of love and care. Chesed. We are anshe chesed, people of loving kindness, or people of agape, if you wanted to translate it into Christianity. We're okay with that, but the immediacy and tenderness of that little act of chesed, as infinitely precious as it is, I think there's still plenty of room for reimagining and reorienting towards more audacious and more long-lasting change.
Yeah.
Totally agree with that.
That's good.
Yeah, and go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
No, please.
I was going to say, all of our traditions have an obligation to charity, right? To kindness. And there are always people that require that in some way. But we are talking about, and I can hear it so clearly in the way you're talking about your communities, in some ways, two very different things, right? Nobody wants to be the object of charity. Everybody wants power and autonomy over their own lives, right? And those are really different things. And this is where this conversation always lands. And I think it's fascinating, right? To say as a church, and we at Trinity find this in our international work, that people have said to us very directly, I mean, nice that you can write us a check. We'd rather actually know how you're doing that with your real estate so that we have that kind of income where we are. Because we could, basically, it's nice when we all agree about what we should do next, but it's a lot better when we can locally decide what it is that we're going to do. So I'd love to hear more about this work to have houses of worship think about property development so that they're both serving the community, generating income, and maintaining their presence in the community?
Yeah, sure. And that for us, when we came into to Borough Hall, we saw that when we look at the grants or the capital dollars that was being spent, houses of worship was very far in between. I don't know if there was even any, maybe one or two. And we tried to again put millions of dollars into these houses of worship, because you have, a church who have all of this property, and yes, still for gentrification, a lot of people are leaving, moving down south. Congregations are getting older. The people who are moving into the communities not really going into these what we call quote unquote black churches, and so you have these big, beautiful edifice with just about 5-10 people in it. You can't maintain it. And so what you do is that you have to do the next best thing. You have land, and then you have land which you probably own in another particular area. So we have been teaching and showing faith leaders that you can be astute, you can still be business-minded, you can still do the work of God, you can still have money for missions and for evangelism and for after-school program if you don't have to pay this heavy overhead and dwindling membership with high building costs. So what do? You transform your property into affordable housing. You use 1 or 2 floors for your community center, for your house of worship. You have a brand new space. You own the property for the rest of your life, and you're able now to do more service for communities. So we've been showing them and shaping them into that sometimes we have to let go of that beautiful building that you have in order to actually tear it down and build back up again. And it has been reimagining, has been a new teaching and learning for faith leaders to actually go in the arena of affordable housing and building. And again, even if it's market rate as well. So that's my work. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of pros and cons. But at the end of the day, we want our churches to survive in Brooklyn. One more thing I will say is that we don't want a city that is soulless. We want a city that has soul, that has vitality, that have people of faith. There's a particular value when you have a level of spirituality in any major city, especially in New York City.
I would say communities of faith, yes, and all income levels.
Yes,
right? Because that's what affordable housing creates, is that we are truly diversity and not a segregated city. And it's an interest, because it is because of law that we have the disparity that we have. Like, this isn't by accident or by luck, right? It is the law. It was law. So to then transform that with actual ownership and change is magnificent. And I think for all of our faith communities, I know even for the one I'm in, the idea that the church should be involved in that, right? In ownership and management and housing, and do that with skill, is even for us something that we wrestle with. What we wrestle with it is, should the clergy be involved in that, right? What should clergy be doing? But I think it serves only one purpose when, excuse me?
I said we are forced to be involved in it.
Well, I actually think it, historically, I think this is true for synagogues as well. I know for Christian clergy, historically, we have been involved in all of these things. This idea that faith is separate from the political and economic realm is a very new idea, and it serves a very particular kind of capitalism, right? Like, it's a very problematic idea. Like, historically, we have always been involved in all of that kind of work.
Sure.
And so, Rabbi Jeremy, feel free to comment on any of that. And also, I think one of the challenges for many of our communities, we have it in our community, is that we are told that proximity and tenderness, we use that language a lot as well, being kind to those that we are told to, that might be dangerous to us, is how we're often, should make us more compassionate, and then should make us people that want to change the systems, that we wonder why, right, about the Jericho Road. Why do people keep getting beaten up here? Why do I keep having to do service? Has that been your experience in your community? What do you think of that? And
you point out that any sort of alleged distinction between faith and public life is a very modern and not terribly healthy distinction, which I totally agree with. At the same time, I would say that I think, looking across the history of Jewish reflection, I think that the idea of individual, like Jewish communities have always had structures of charitable giving. Jewish communities, it is a matter of Jewish law that every community has to have both a soup kitchen and a daily soup kitchen and a weekly distribution of cash support. This is what we do. This is the rule. We've got a whole system of both a theoretical system inherited and practical systems of execution. But I also do think that in most of pre-modern times, people thought that individual virtue as contributing to these kind of social institutions was going to get the job done. And I think that in the United States right now, we are coming to an awareness that whether this is always going to be the case or just is the case right now in the need for a major corrective, that inequality is a problem so significant that it is not going to be fixed by individual virtue. Right? The fact that somebody can be charitable or that somebody can be doing acts of kindness, 100% it should motivate us to greater sense of love of community, love of other, to imitate that divine generosity. We have a very central teaching in Judaism about as you do in Christianity, of course, about imitating God. And our particular way of describing it is, as God clothes the naked, so you clothe the naked. As God feeds the hungry, so you feed the hungry. As God comforts the mourner and visits the sick, so you do all of these things. And I think that most of the time that clergy people or observant or pious Jews thought about that, they thought about individual behavior and not systemic behavior. And so that's to me another question mark about how religion locks onto, or religion hooks onto our social problems. Matt said earlier in the conversation that an organization like Habitat, and I firmly agree with this is my own experience as a Jew being involved with Habitat Builds and Brush with Kindness and the Building on Faith programs. You don't have to agree about this, you don't have to agree about that, you don't have to agree about religion, you don't have to agree about politics. We can all agree that this is excellent work. And I think that's true. I also think that some of the problems that we face are pretty big, and so I think that's just a real challenge on how we extend the conversation from individual virtue to systemic analysis and transformation.
Yeah, that's so good, and it's actually it brings up some conversations that I've had recently. I'm the kind of guy that people sometimes get mad at this time of year during election cycles, because I engage people more than they may want to be engaged in some difficult conversations, and some of the perspectives of people of faith, and I think that as you mentioned, Rabbi Jeremy, folks from my tradition also have that same kind of more focus on the virtue and the personal piety and how I act personally. And it's interesting because I've heard from some of those people that come from that tradition that that the government should play less of a role generally, and that it's the church that should be taking care of people's needs, right? And my response to that is I don't think the church, even if everybody actually tithed the way that they should be tithing, and I think everybody, the stats show that people don't necessarily meet that 10%, wouldn't have the resources to cover everybody's health care, for example, right? They wouldn't have the resources to provide and build housing for and house everybody. I mean, there is just a base level of what our society, if we want to see our faith reflected in our society and in our culture, then it needs to go beyond what an individual congregation can do through our individual resources, and how we engage with the society and the culture together to try to build a more just economy, to build a more just housing market, to build a more just healthcare system. So it's from our perspective, that's what we, have tried to do. And I'm glad to hear, Rabbi Jeremy, as you've engaged with us over the years, that we try to do that. And we try to educate people on how the tax lien system is fundamentally deficient in the way that it predominantly negatively affects low-income home buyers of color, especially those with that are seniors, or how the dealing with the criminal justice system results in negative aspects of housing coming out of the criminal justice system and helps perpetrate inequalities in that way, or how the affordable housing sector and how fair housing deals with where we can build, and how Habitat predominantly has only been able to build in historically redline communities, and it's very difficult to build projects like the one that we're trying to build in Little Italy because of maybe a NIMBYism, or because of the cost to build in the heart of a wealthy part of Manhattan. So it's really coming together and trying to address all of those things, while we need the funding and we need the partnerships to help continue to build and to continue to preserve housing. But we also need people to come alongside us and to learn about these systems and how we might be able to change those policies to build a more just, a more just society, more just city, state, and country. So that we don't need necessarily to provide as much service, because we've built the beloved community as it is.
I mean, one of the barriers. So at Trinity, we've been working on the larger closed records project. There's some time. It's going to take a minute. I think we're not quite done, but spending a couple of years really engaged in this work maybe illustrates the point that I think the points we've all just made, that I can help somebody. I can literally pay every bill, take every call, help somebody get to every meeting after they've been released from jail or prison and having served time. But the law itself will prevent that person. The law, not aberrations, not people's bad decisions. The law will prevent that person from full access to housing, to work, to all kinds of things, right? Because of the law. And it's been, in the world of direct engagement, for me, it has been so powerful to be a person paying someone's unaffordable bail for literally a ridiculously minor offense that we would all forgive in a second, a crime of need, a stolen coat or stolen food, something like that. An absurd bail that is a deposit on a house in most of this country. The law, right, the system is so organized against certain people that I know these things intellectually. I've read them to encounter that system. And the person that is my age, that looks like me, that is trapped in this system, has absolutely changed my commitment, has, in a very come to the altar kind of moment, right, changed my commitment to this work, and has made it really clear that I cannot be kind or rich enough to help that woman. Really, the law has to be on her side, right? And that, I hear what you're saying, that it is that there's a great variety of opinion in my church, right, on how you approach that, how you get there. We're going to vote for different people, next Tuesday in my church. And I think it is part of, I think we are actually at a moment, this is my question for you all, where like the 30s and 40s and the 60s, where we actually decided on a different social contract, right? We heard some different voices than we'd heard before and decided that actually people shouldn't retire into abject poverty. White people, we said at the time that white working class folks might have access to mortgages, that Black people should have access to the vote. We decided on different social contracts. I wonder if we're in a moment like that, where we could decide, we might have the opportunity to decide collectively on something different, frankly, for me, because of the work of BLM. But I wonder if you're feeling that where you are, and where you might see that going if you do.
Well, I don't. I'm worried about American democracy in general, and I think that the Depression and World War, you mentioned the 30s and the 40s and the 60s. I think the Depression and World War II, and what we look back on it now as maybe not we on this call, but America often looks back on the Great Society and the social safety net programs of that era as like a failure, which is not true. That's actually a total misrepresentation. But the country in those moments was largely, there were certainly opponents, but the country was very unified. And you said that in your church people are going to vote for different candidates. And I suppose in my synagogue there will be some number of people who will vote for different candidates. But we are a silo. We have a great deal of agreement, not 100% agreement, but a great deal of agreement. And I think that all too often, this is what is heartbreaking to me as an American who, like, if you believe in democracy, even the people who you don't agree with are actually contributing. You have to think that they're contributing and making the society that they would like to see. And that can be pretty hard right now sometimes. And from all angles, people look at other people and think, you're just a bad American and I want you to leave, or I want to secede or something like that. And so I would love it if in America we sufficiently came together to have a broadly accepted new social contract. And I am dubious about the capabilities of American, the diverse American voices in our democracy right now who would respect people they disagree with and come to some shared, ownership of the republic right now. I think that this is the worst thing about lots of bad things that have happened in the country in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I'm going to go to you, Pastor Monrose. I'm not a historian, and I won't challenge your understanding of history. But I will say one thing: the nation was very divided in all the three areas that I just listed. I mean, they were like family breaking, nation breaking, barely voted in kind. There was not a consensus, and we didn't actually reach it. And then the reaction to them created crisis. I would agree with you. I don't think any of them have failed, but I do think it's important. King used to list the number of churches in Birmingham that supported them when they, and it was very few, including the black churches. So I do agree. I mean, I'm not going to argue that we're not in a horrible time, that democracy is at stake. I completely agree with you. But I will challenge the idea of an American consensus and who counts in it.
Yeah, I guess show me the time as American that we were in consensus about anything to deal with the poor. That's very, I don't know when that would have been. And I think that now we're moving quite away from that. In my family, in my siblings, we're going to be voting for different candidates too as well. And that's where it is today. It's just a difficult time for America, I think. And I think that the black church, I want to say this, straight face, is one of the last institutions that's going to save this democracy. Because we have been, again, on the lowest front of all of the injustices that you could find, and yet still kept the faith. Yet still was loyal to our government, went to war in Vietnam and went to World War I and World War II, and fighting for rights and then coming back home and not having the rights that we were fighting for overseas. And I think people, as we look, they were steeped in the tradition of faith, in tradition of church. So there was also a whitewashed religion of Christianity as well, who also has to take some of the burden and some of the pain of us being here at this point in time. Because what is upholding before us is the idea of Christianity, whether it's evangelical or otherwise, or the black church, or whatever you want to class it. So I think that I would love to see America come to a better place than where we are. And I think that the election is just going to pull us further along. So that's why I think we have to continue to raise our prophetic voices, the halls of Congress and even beyond that. That we are people that can strive. We are people who just want civil rights. A comedian was making a joke as well. It's like blacks, they're asking for civil rights. That's like the most basic thing to ask for. Why don't we ask for something else? Civil rights? So I think that hopefully we're going to get somewhere in this next election. We're prayerfully and hopefully we will move forward.
I just want to say about that. While I'm not going to deny, obviously, that that there were divisions in the countries in those times. I also think that at a core level, there was a very positive, especially in the 30s and 40s, and even into the 60s, where, as we can remember, Lyndon Johnson won a massive electoral victory in '64, massive, overwhelming electoral victory. Of course, it did give rise to a different kind of conservative movement, but I think people felt, and I hope I'm not being romantic, invested in an American project that was commonly held, that they felt invested in a republic. And they did not, regard their fellow Americans with whom they disagreed, at least sometimes, as an enemy that had to be defeated, right? And I think that if we are going to talk about, building a beautiful city and filling a city with soul, it has to involve caring for and kind of respecting lots of people with whom one differs. And I don't see that in this country right now. And to me, that is a very terrifying prospect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's part of that is, culture wars and that kind of thing. But also, frankly, a big part of what's happening is Black and brown voices are speaking. And it is the foreseeable future where there isn't a white majority, and that's different. And it comes back to where we started from. That's different than charity to a powerless group with a few token superstars, right? It's a different landscape that I think no one on this call is afraid of, but we know that many in this country are afraid of, right? And so it makes a particularly volatile. We've been a democracy with a lot of disenfranchised people within it, and interestingly, of all things, housing, right, is illustrative of that value, right? Who gets to be charitable and kind and liberal and in conversation, and who is disenfranchised, right? Both unhoused and disenfranchised, and that I think things are coming to a head in a really powerful way in our nation about it. And I would be remiss if I did not offer you all an opportunity to help the people that are watching this call thinking about how they get their church communities involved or their faith communities involved that are in similar settings to yours, and thinking about getting people to think about housing and how they either serve their community or empower their community, or begin to think about change, whatever the right spot is for them. So can you all tell us about what you're doing locally?
So I would say you want to also talk about how some individuals can get involved locally as well, or just what I'm doing locally? I'm always local. I'm not national.
Yes. Basically, what are you doing? How do you do it so that people can think about this? Yeah.
I think that one of the things that I started a few years ago, a group of pastors came to meet with the borough president in Brooklyn, and we tried to figure out how could we help you. And they were losing the churches. So what we said is that form a group, and they formed something called Kingdom Faith Developers. And every year since, we have been holding what we call Building Brooklyn Right conferences to help navigate the nuts and bolts of government, but also to help them with developing the course of developing the process of filling out capital funding to the city. So we have had to walk them through this process. And so locally speaking, right now we have a great project coming up right now called Ebenezer Plaza with 526 affordable units in the heart of Brownsville. And it's a place where you had miles and miles of just abundant buildings. And now if you see it, it's a beautiful edifice that's coming up. There'll be a church, there'll be a community center, there'll be a strip mall for commercial property. And this is from a small church who had a great idea or a big idea of buying 2 city lots. And so my work is to help faith leaders specifically navigate this complexity, to take them from a concept, put it on paper, help them through the process to make it a reality. So that's the work that I've been doing locally to help faith leaders throughout this time.
Well, I don't have anything like that to say. That's pretty amazing. No, as I said before, I think that we are just feeling our way. And if I could, I represent on this call not the community that has, turned itself into an engine of social transformation, but a community that wants to play its part in helping build a more just, economically just, more racially just, more economically equal, and more diverse community, in our neighborhood. I mean, my zip code of 10025 certainly has super duper, like, unbelievably expensive apartments and, lots of traditional housing stock, including lots of public housing stock. So we do, in some strange way, have a nice diversity of ethnic and racial and economic levels in our community. But the experiences that you have in Brooklyn are a little bit different than the ones that we have here in 10025, and the sheer cost of real estate is going to always be a challenge. Something like this in New York. We are among a number of synagogues that are holding a forum tonight on homelessness, although it's really more oriented. It's a Zoom-based event, so it has the limitations of Zoom-based events. But we're holding a forum on homelessness. It's more oriented towards the shelter population than thinking about how to build a more affordable housing stock broadly, or certainly. Affordable housing can also mean rental housing, but the housing ownership that you're talking about is that much more profound. I mean, we're finding our way, we're feeling our way, and I'm glad to be part of the Building on Faith community to help find allies and do this work together.
That's great. Thank you so much to both of you for all of those comments and for the question, Reverend Winnie. I mean, Habitat for Humanity, New York City, we have a lot of ways for faith communities to kind of partner with us as we try to fulfill our mission. There's the kind of classic Habitat model, which is more directly kind of oriented to volunteer engagement. And as right now, we don't necessarily have volunteers on our construction sites. We are engaging folks with our Brush with Kindness work, which includes revitalizing community spaces. And we're going to be doing more and more of that as things go. So we do want to encourage that if you're part of a faith community or know of a community project that you think that Habitat could help support, we definitely recommend that you reach out and connect with us on that. We also have been doing a lot more work around affordable housing preservation and working with existing HDFC cooperatives and limited equity cooperatives. And many folks in the faith community have congregants that live in buildings that could use Habitat for Humanity support in helping stabilize their finances and their governance, doing various kinds of support when it comes to construction preservation services. So we are really moving into a period where we're hoping to engage through our Building on Faith effort congregations, of course, to help support our mission if they are financially able, to really come alongside us and potentially helping to serve their congregations and identifying pipeline opportunities for us to engage folks where they are, to help stabilize their buildings. And talking about ownership and self-determination, are there opportunities for people in your congregations to partner with us in potentially having tenants actually convert their buildings to affordable limited equity cooperatives and actually become owners of the properties that they already live in? And we've been kind of leaders in the community land trust movement to create a kind of a permanent alternative market for affordable home ownership that won't expire, but that will live on. And so we continue to advocate for policies that support that on the local and the state level. We advocate for resources on the federal level. So through our Building on Faith initiative, we would love for congregations to join us in really on all of those things, service, funding, advocacy, and finding opportunities for us to support congregations that want to develop and the congregants therein that might be able to use our services. Are we still on?
Yeah.
I think we're. I really don't know what to say. I mean,
that was an amazing last word.
Fantastic. That was the last word. Yeah. I think we should leave that as the last word. I can say thank you all for this conversation. And Rabbi Jeremy, I apologize for giving you a hard time, but
we have interchange. This is what it's all about.
And like you, I'm in awe of Pastor Monrose. That is remarkable. That is God's work. And thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Maybe you get oh, sorry, Matt, do you have a?
Yeah, if I just might, just to kind of transition, I forgot to mention this. We do encourage people to stay on. The next session is going to be a really interesting one. One of our great supporters and volunteers, Brooke, is going to be interviewing Piper Kerman, the author of Orange is the New Black. And they're going to be talking about her experience with the criminal justice system and how that overlaps and affects housing from people that are coming in or out of that system. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. And please continue. Thank you for your support, and please join in on tomorrow night for the main program and the exciting Empire State Building lighting as well.